this morning. We have some new folks and we have some old folks, so it's good to have all of y'all. Been a little bit of a hiatus due to COVID in the area and then health issues that I've had, but I'm glad to be back. We are picking up where we left off last February, I guess, and we had already talked about an overview of Suwannee County's history, what we're going to be going through over the next hopefully 3 years, or perhaps more. And the last one before I was on hiatus was a discussion of the Native Americans. So today we're going to get into the Spanish period, the first Spanish period specifically of Suwannee County's history. Now then, we talked about at the end of the previous presentation, we talked about Hernando de Soto and how he quote unquote discovered Florida in 1519. Well, not much was done about the interior of Florida for another 40, 50 years. Florida had been claimed by Spain, but they really did nothing. So what happened was, in about 1564, the French decided, you know what, we've got territories over in that area of these, the North American area. We're going to lay claim to it because Spain hasn't done anything with Florida, so we're going to try to take it. So they established a colony there at Fort Caroline, which is now present-day Jacksonville. And so they established as a drawing of Fort Caroline, a period drawing, showing what it was. And basically they said, you know what, if Spain doesn't need it, we're going to take it because we can always use the territory. And so they established this small fort in the Jacksonville area. They're not even entirely sure where it is. There's a couple of different spots they think, but they're not exactly sure. But somewhere, St. Johns River, Jacksonville area, North Jacksonville. Well, Spain decided they didn't like it. Again, they had already claimed it as theirs. So they sent an expedition over. And in 1565, it kind of basically resulted in the establishing of St. Augustine. So the French at Fort Caroline, 1564, established St. Augustine, 1565. So the Spanish established that town, that community, and then led their forces, marched their forces northward to attack Fort Caroline. Well, the problem was the French got wind of it. And so they sent a fleet of ships with most of their soldiers from Fort Caroline, down to attack St. Augustine. Well, as is prone to do in Florida, we had hurricanes or very bad weather. If not a hurricane, it was very bad weather. And so the French forces were pushed down past St. Augustine and shipwrecked down at the Matanzas Inlet, just south of St. Augustine. At the same time, that's when the Spanish forces were arriving by land at Fort Caroline, wiped out and massacred the inhabitants. They saved the women and children, but they killed pretty much all the men. And I think a few of them escaped, a couple dozen escaped, but pretty much just women and children were left. Part of this being due to all these religious wars that have been happening for a few centuries. Catholics versus the Huguenots and whatnot. So the French were not Catholic, therefore fit to be killed. And so Fort Caroline was captured, was razed, destroyed, and the Spanish soldiers marched back to St. Augustine. They got there, they heard, oh, the French have shipwrecked just south of here. So then the Spanish marched south, and the French, the ones that were left anyway, thought, okay, we're going to surrender. We're going to be given mercy because we're basically unarmed at this point. Well, the Spanish decided to just slaughter them all. And that's why it's called Matanzas Inlet. Matanzas is Spanish for blood. So I don't know if you knew that or not. But really, if it had not been for Fort Caroline being established in Jacksonville, there would be no St. Augustine, or St. Augustine as we know it anyway. So that helped to establish, St. Augustine helped to establish a greater Spanish presence. Because the Spanish realized, you know what, if we don't do anything with this territory, somebody's going to come and just take it from us. And so they started moving more and more people in. So this is how they kind of divided the Spanish territory into these different provinces. You can see several of them, Apalachee, Ustoga, Timucua, Aquarica, different ones based on or what they assumed as the speakers, Indian speakers there, or Native American speakers. So later on, most of this territory just came to be called the Timucua territory. But Timucua proper is actually in Suwannee County, the Suwannee Valley area. Different dialects, Native American dialects, but those are kind of how the Spanish set it up, different provinces, and they went from there. These things, they changed, the borders changed as the years passed, as the Native Americans died. or were moved, and new ones came in, different things. But that's basically how it started out. The Spanish settlements continued to grow. They first started sending in Jesuit missionaries. There's different Catholic orders, and Jesuit order of missionaries started in. They tried to start converting the interior of Florida, but they didn't get very far. Their manners, I guess, were kind of offensive to the Indians, or the Native Americans. And excuse me if I say Indians. I think y'all know that. Okay, just making sure. I never know, especially if it's on camera. Native Americans and or Indians did not take too kindly to the Jesuits, and so they didn't get very far, and a lot of their missionaries were killed. So that group stopped trying to colonize or missionize the interior of Florida. They also sent the Dominicans in. They started, I think, down in the Tampa Bay area, started to work northward. That didn't last very long at all. I think the first group, most of them were killed after a few weeks. And so that kind of fizzled out. But then there was the Franciscan order, and they got a lot more response, positive response, I should say, from the Timucua and from the other Native Americans in the area. I guess their methods were a little bit better, a little bit less brutal. They worked a little bit better with these Native Americans. And so the Franciscan missionaries spread throughout the interior of Florida over the 16th and the 17th century. Their two main primary missions were, of course, to spread Catholicism to those pagan Indians, and also, hey, this is going to help provide labor and support for our fledgling colony for places like St. Augustine, pictured there. So this is kind of how the Franciscans did things. They would move into a territory or to a settlement. They would then find the cacique. Some people call them cacique. I've called them cacique for years, but I guess cacique is probably the better phrase or better wording. But a cacique was basically the village chief. We call him a chief. But they would find that chief, that cacique, convert him. And because he was looked upon as kind of like a god to the rest of the folks in the Indian village, they would then be more likely to respond to Catholicism. So that's kind of what they did. They started at the top and worked their way down. Sometimes these caciques would help build churches and other religious buildings for these Spanish missionaries. And they would make sure, of course, these missionaries would try to establish their main presence in the capital city of that village or that area, that region. Some of these caciques were just over the village, others were over that territory. And so the Spanish tried to start at the very top, and it would spread out. And it seemed to be very successful for the most part. These missions allowed the Spanish to expand their influence, expand their borders. They also were allowed to station soldiers there sometimes, especially when there were some uprisings or influence from other European sources that were also fighting in this area for North America. So it allowed them to do that. Also, rest stops. They didn't have a hotel per se. You couldn't just stop over the Hotel 6 or whatever. And so these mission sites were rest areas along what became the Camino Real. Right there's a drawing of it. That Royal Road, the Spanish Royal Road, Camino Real. And so these mission sites were about a day apart, usually, sometimes a little bit less. But you could stop if you're traveling from St. Augustine over to Pensacola, which was established decades after St. Augustine, but it was another major point in Spanish Florida. But they could stop at these mission sites. So these mission sites were very important to the establishment of European ideas and thoughts in Florida, not just Suwannee County. We had in Suwannee County several mission sites. Now, several of these pictures I'm going to show you in this presentation are ones I took years ago at Mission San Luis de Apalachee over in Tallahassee. Nice place. It's probably been 10 or 15 years since I had gone there up until a few months ago. I went again. Still beautiful. Lots of stuff. It's basically a reconstruction of an original Spanish mission site. Probably the biggest Spanish mission site in Florida, to be honest. So a lot of stuff. Church, convent, all kinds of different buildings there. If you have not been, it's worth the $4 or $5 to go. Look around. They've got a museum they built since last time I'd been there, which has a lot of the relics that they have discovered there. And like I said, they've got all these buildings. So it's very nice. It's a living history. So they have folks that are in period garb, and they will stop you. They will talk to you. They will tell you how life was lived there in the 1600s. So it's very interesting. So even though it's Appalachian Indians and not Timucuan Indians, a lot of the things are similar. But we did have several mission sites here in Suwannee County. Ones like San Juan de Guacara, Santa Catalina de Afucia, Santa Cruz de Tarihica, San Agustin de Tarihica. And we'll get into those in just a minute. So that was the good part. The bad part was, of course, if you remember anything about your history lessons, the Native Americans were not immune to the old world diseases that the Europeans had since learned how to get rid of and deal with. So these Indians that lived here between 20,000 and 150,000 in this area, depending on who you talk to, they were decimated by these old world diseases. Not only that, because the Spanish influence was now being brought in, those who were fighting the Spanish, like the French and British mainly, or English at the time, led to wars, which led to attacks, which destroyed mission sites, which killed or captured Native Americans. So it was, or the Indians would probably say it was a bad thing for them. So it is what it is, but it did help establish Florida as we know it in Suwannee County, more specifically, as we know it today. Now, here is a drawing from, I think that's the Florida Division of Historical Resources, showing mission sites along the Camino Real. I've got a few other slides of it too, but you can see some of the major roads. Highway 90 up here. So that gives you an idea. Here's the Suwannee River right here. You can see several mission sites, those that I just mentioned. That's several of them right there. These are some of the mission sites according to John Worth, who's an archaeologist who's done a lot of, an anthropologist who's done a lot of studies over the years. And I've circled the area of Suwannee County. Notice all these different ones around. And then I've zoomed in here to show you San Juan de Guacara and a few others, San Martin de Ayacucho, the Santa Cruz de Tarihica, and San Agustin de Eureka. These are pre-Timucuan Rebellion mission site locations in most of these cases. And I'll talk about that rebellion in a little bit. But these are some of the sites they believe. Now, there's another one, another gentleman by the name of Keith Diggs, I believe, who puts the sites there. Some of the same sites in the same locations, but some in some other proposed locations. The problem with this, there's several different ideas because we haven't found all these mission sites yet. We're talking about 400 plus years of people coming in and out. This was a very agricultural area, and still is. Lots of digging for timber and just destruction of the land and getting into the land. So a lot of these mission sites are gone. We still don't know where they are. Some of them we do, and I'll show you one in particular in a little bit that we know a lot about. But there's a lot of these they're still trying to figure out exactly where it is. The other problem is because a lot of them moved after the Timucuan Rebellion in 1656, they're having trouble figuring out which one, is this the old one or the new one, or is this a different one? Lots of questions, lots of issues. This changes every few years. So one of the mission sites was, and probably the earliest in Suwannee County, was the mission San Juan de Guacara. I put the number 1 by it because it's the first location. It did get moved after the Timucuan Rebellion, which again I'll talk about. It was probably our first mission in Suwannee County, established between 1605 and 1612. They're still not even sure. They think most probably 1609 was when it was established. So it's already a bit over 400 years since that mission was established here in Suwannee County. It was established near Baptizing Springs. See it on the top right of this drawing. So if you know where Baptizing Springs is, you know where the original San Juan de Guacara is. Let's see. It was not actually on the Camino Real. It was a few miles off. Kind of like an offshoot because it was already an existing Native American village. And that's what, again, they would do. They would go into where villages already were located, plop a church down, put a priest living area there, and some other things. And San Juan de Guacara was no different. So this is what they would do. I put this one and a lot of other pictures that we're about to see on here for you to see because unlike a lot of these other missions that are still, if they're known, it's not public knowledge where they are, this one is posted on the website, on the state's website. All this information I got actually this morning, most of it, this morning from the Division of Historical Resources site. Just had to make a note there. Oh, this one was located in the 1970s. Why? Because a timber company was coming in to plant pines and all that kind of stuff, and they stumbled across some of these ruins as they were digging. And so they called in the archaeologists, who then spent a couple of years off and on going through and studying the remains. So there's a 1976 excavation and a 1978 excavation. And this pretty much is where all this is coming from. So this is some from the 1978 dig. And this is them working on one of the areas. You know, lots of trees were in areas before it was all cut down and replaced by timber, marketable timber anyway. Then digging, finding several parts of one of the buildings. Over here is a picture of a pig that they had found, a pig burial that was discovered on site. And again, this is not stuff that I normally would have posted on here, especially with it being videoed, but since it is on publicly available websites, I figure I'm not doing any more harm. So these are two of the buildings in San Juan de Lucar. The left one is the convento, which is where the priests live, and then the right one is the church, which was on the highest point on the property. So you can see there's not much left. Sandy red clay, there's some post molds, some yellow clay line pits for both buildings, and a dotted line showing where they think the walls extended. Gives you an idea of the size. So here's the 3 meters, so 9-10 feet. So the priest place, the convento, was probably about 15 by 15 with the hearth in the middle. The church building was a little bit bigger. I'd say probably about 35 feet, 40 feet, based on what they're showing us anyway. So I mean, this is all that's left of, this and the next few pictures are all that's left of that site. It's not like you can go up and see there's a building there. We'll talk about it more next month, but we'll read about some of the incidences where Americans, early United States Americans, I should say, came through these areas and found these abandoned mission sites, and some of the stuff they found there that the Spanish had lost or abandoned like 100 years prior to it. Then they could still see part of these buildings and such. But 1976, 1978, today, no, you're not going to see it. So anyway, there's some of the buildings. And here are some of the Native American dwelling areas to the south of the church and the convento. Lots of little spots, average depth potholes, post molds, those kinds of things, smudge pits, fire pits, trash pits, those things that an archaeologist will find. So lots of different information there. So that was one. San Juan de Lucar was probably the earliest in Suwannee County. Another one was San Agustin de Tarihica, was probably established, depending on who you talk to, around 1616 near Live Oak or Suwannee Springs. Most of the maps show it around Suwannee Springs on the north side of the county. But whether that's true or not, we're not sure. We haven't found it yet, obviously. Or somebody would say, no, it's exactly here. There are other alternate spellings for it besides Tarihica. Sometimes it's called Utoka, Niahica, or Exoica. So again, this is a picture not of that mission, but of Mission San Luis over in Tallahassee. So we don't know for sure when it was founded. Again, around 1616, but they do know from existing writings that it was very busy in the 1620s. A lot of information about what was going on there, people visiting, Indians being used for labor, those kinds of things. And so it was important in the 1620s to the Spanish mission system here in Suwannee County, at least. Still don't know too much about it after that, but it was probably abandoned after the Timucuan Rebellion. Again, I'll talk about it more in a little bit, but a lot of the mission sites were abandoned after that or relocated. Now, there was a convent shortly thereafter the rebellion called San Agustin de Tarihica. So it's possible it was just moved and renamed. We don't know for sure. Lots of stuff we don't know about it. And that new site could be around Peacock Lake, Branford, Beachville, even O'Brien. So we just don't know. Where it was located, that new site was abandoned in 1675. and they were resettled in other places. Now, I do have knowledge of a location at Peacock Lake. It's possible that was where this was relocated, but we don't know for sure. So that rebellion I've been talking about and mentioning several times, 1656, this is a picture of Castillo de San Marcos over in St. Augustine, which did not exist at this point. It was started a few years later, but I don't have any earlier pictures, sorry. Well, I don't have any pictures from that era because they didn't have photographs. I don't have any drawings of the original fort area in St. Augustine. But basically what happened was this rebellion was decades in fomenting. It was not an overnight thing. As the Spanish further colonized Florida, they were using these Native Americans for a lot of, basically just above slave labor. They weren't considered much more than slaves, which was not so good to the Native Americans. Furthermore, Florida was a very poor colony. It wasn't like Cuba or some of those other places where they had tons of sugar cane and other cash crops. It was a very poor colony throughout its Spanish history, to be honest. And so they had to use these Native Americans to supplement the non-existent Europeans that were not arriving to, why do we want to go over to the New World and die in this miserable place? So they weren't getting the colonists that they wanted to get, and so they were having to use slave or Native American labor to build forts, to build ports, to build houses and other structures. And so that was going on. Plus we've got that old world disease decimating the Native Americans in this area, in all of Florida. Plus what happens was every year the Spanish required a draft from each village or each region saying, hey, you've got to send me X amount of males of between the ages of this and this that can work. And so they were gone for half the year sometimes, working 100, 200 miles away from where their family was. The families didn't travel with them. So when you take the males away, most of the males away from a village, you're going to have less births the next year. So it was a bad cycle, vicious cycle that just kept going on. So you have less births, less kids coming around. A lot of them were dying from these diseases. You have warfare going on between the French and the Spanish and the British. And so all these things are just snowballing to affect the Native Americans. And eventually they got tired of it. So in 1656, basically what happened was there was the threat of English invasion to attack St. Augustine. They'd done it before. They were going to try to do it again. And so the governor of Spanish Florida, whose name was Rebolledo, he called up the Native American militia, in addition to the Spanish militia that was already there. Well, a lot of them sent soldiers or militiamen. The Timucuan region, Suwannee County region, said, no, we're not going to do it. We don't want to do it. There was a rebellion of sorts. A few people were killed. I think 7 was the number. But 2 of them were in Suwannee County. There's a place called Calocula, which is probably near Royal Springs. They are thinking anyway. These 2 guys went to bed one night, Francisco Vasquez and Geronimo, not the Geronimo we hear of in the movies, but a Native American named Geronimo. So they stopped at this post, trading post in Calocula for the night and went to bed, and they were killed. They were scalped and whatnot by these Timucuan rebellions, rebels. And so they were 2 of about 7 people killed. And there were some folks in what's now Alachua County killed at a big farm down there, and a few others just around. It was not a huge rebellion by death. I mean, when you look at how many deaths. But it was a big deal. It was a problem. It was a problem because Spanish authority was being fought against by the people that should have been seeing them as support. Well, the governor was too busy preparing for that invasion by the English to deal with it right away. He had to make sure St. Augustine was fortified. They were building up the fortifications, adding to the fortifications, and preparing for a possible siege. So that went on for a few months, but after about 3 months, hurricane season came in. And the Europeans had learned by then not to send ships in hurricane season. They would go to the port for a few months, wait it out, and then go, and the next year they would start their invasions. And this happened even through the American Revolution. You could see as the British and the French and whatnot would come into the Americas, you could see when and why. So the English decided wisely not to attack during hurricane season and possibly lose their ships and all their men. So that threat of attack was over, that threat of invasion was over. So that gave Robledo time to deal with that rebellion eventually. And so what he did was, oh yeah, that's them partying, by the way. I'd skip this. So he sent men over to the interior of Florida. And what happened was these rebels pretty much had holed up just to the west of us, west of the Suwannee River, in what's now Madison County, and built up a fortification similar to this photograph from the Civil War. Basically just a earthen fort. You know, they had 3 months to prepare because they knew the Spanish were going to fight against them, so they prepared and were ready for that. But when the time came, they realized they were outnumbered, outgunned, and after protracted negotiations, the Timucuan Indians surrendered to the Spanish. The caciques included ones from Tarihica, Tarihica, San Martin, and San Juan de Lucar. So out of all those chiefs, most of them were from Suwannee County. So this was the center of the rebellion here in Suwannee County. Well, what happened was, because of that, a lot of things changed. A lot of things changed. Immediately, those caciques that were involved were executed. They were garroted or imprisoned, or garroted and imprisoned, and they were replaced by caciques that were loyal to the Spanish, even if they didn't fall in the hierarchy of, who was supposed to replace the cacique when they're killed. Now the Spanish said, that one likes us, that one's going to be the new cacique. So they put pro-Spanish caciques in place of those that rebelled. The other thing was several of those mission sites, especially in Suwannee County, were moved. Instead of being 2, 3, 4, 7 miles off the Camino Real, they were moved under the Camino Real in sometimes more defensible areas. Better locations, like San Juan de Lucar. And then another thing they did was, all right, these Timucuans may be a bunch of rebels. We're going to bring in other Indian groups. We're going to just mingle them. So they can't put up a unified front. It reminds me of what the Assyrians did back in the 600s, 700s BC, when the Assyrian Empire over in the Middle East, here's my history coming in, when they would conquer a territory, conquer a country, they would remove pretty much all the folks, or most of them, out of that territory, disperse them somewhere else, way on the other side of their empire, and bring others from that other side and throw it in there and commingle them. So basically it meant there were lots of different people from lots of different cultures who didn't always get along as well, maybe well enough to not kill each other, but not well enough to stand up to fight the Assyrian Empire. So this is kind of what the Spanish did after the Timucuan Rebellion of 1656. So a lot of these other tribes were moved into those that I was showing you earlier, with those different provinces and their names. They were moved into the Timucuan territory to kind of soften the hatred, I guess, the Timucuan had. This is supposedly a post-rebellion map of mission sites. Again, Suwannee River up there, you can see, I think it's number 28, that's San Juan de Lucar after it got moved to near Charles Springs. And then 31, 32, 33 are some of those other ones that were moved. Here is a note, I've got a copy of it, or quoted from a letter written to the Queen of Spain by the Bishop of Cuba. He wrote it in 1674, 1675. And what this bishop did was he traveled into the Timucuan territory, to North Florida, not just the Timucuan area, but the ones to the east and to the west of them, and the Appalachian areas and all. And he just visited all these mission sites. And it's very helpful because he lists them in order as he visited, point A to point B to point B to point C, but he also says how far away they were from each other. So that has helped archaeologists determine where some of these mission sites are, or where they should be. Let me read it to you. Oh, just so you know, a league is about 3 miles, depending on who's counting, but it's about 3 miles. So he says, the province of Timucua is 10 leagues from the city of St. Augustine, on the bank of the river Corrientes, which is the St. John's. is the village and mission of San Diego de Salvatore. The river is very turbulent and almost a league and a half in width, so that's wide. Talking about St. John's River there. From there to the village and mission of Santa Fe, there are some 20 uninhabited leagues, so about 60 miles. Santa Fe is the principal mission of this province. Off to the side toward the southern border, at a distance of 3 leagues, is the deserted mission and village of San Francisco. 12 leagues from Santa Fe is the mission of Santa Catalina, with Ajujica, 3 leagues away in Santa Cruz de Tarihica, 2. 7 leagues away on the bank of the large river Guacara, which is the Suwannee River, is the mission of San Juan of the same name. 10 leagues further on is that of San Pedro de Puerto Riba, which is in Madison County. That of Santa Helena de Macaba. 4 more is that of San Mateo. Then 2 more, that is of San Miguel de Asalil. Last is this Timucuan or Musgrove province. So again, after the rebellion, it was moved. San Juan de Guacara was moved to Charles Springs, and that's why it's called San Juan de Guacara number 2. Shift about 7 miles to the west, and one of the added duties to this mission site was because it was on the Suwannee River, they didn't have bridges, they had ferries. And so these Native Americans that lived there and worked there, a lot of them had to ferry travelers back and forth across the river. The existing writings say that this was not a very fun thing. The Indians didn't like to do that. And so there were a lot of people that deserted. They said, forget this Catholicism stuff, forget living here, I'm out of here. So a lot of the Indians moved. They didn't like all that work because it was somebody wanted to get across, they had to stop what they were doing day or night and go help them cross, because again, these Native Americans were looked at as just above slaves and sometimes not any better than slaves, because of course Europeans were the best and the brightest, and go Europeans. Let's see. I do have a mission site plan of this one, but this is not one that's publicly available, so I can't show it to you. But it's very interesting. But pretty much around Charles Springs, if you've been there, just to the south is some mission site remnants, if you dig deep enough, and to the north are mission site remnants. I had, probably 15 years ago now, I had a gentleman come to me at the office, and he owned property just to the south of the Charles Springs property. He said, I was putting in some footers for an extension to my living room, and I found some ruins. It's like, I think I know what you found. So I showed the map to him and said, is this where you are? Yeah. It's like, you might want to call the state to let them know. So I don't know whether he did. He was afraid they were going to take his property, so I'm not sure he ever did. He might have just built right over it, and nobody's none the wiser. But you never know what you can find. San Juan de Guacara lasted, after that Timucuan Rebellion, lasted about 25, 30 more years. It was destroyed on August 30th, 1691 by Indians to the west, spurred on by the British, or the English at that time. So it didn't last too much longer. Another mission site in Suwannee County, Santa Catalina de Afucia. Now then, that one was, let's see. One thing I did not point out that I should have pointed out was these names. They pretty much all follow the same pattern, these mission sites, most of them. Santa Catalina, what the Spanish would do was whatever feast day of whatever saint it was that they established it. This one's St. Catherine. So they would name it that, and then the location, which was Afucia, was the name of, or what they had called it anyway, the Indian village. So it's Santa Catalina de Afucia. Most of the rest of them have that same thought pattern. Mission San Juan de Guacara was because it was on the Suwannee River, or what they called San Juan de Guacara. But you'll see that throughout the rest of them. It's the feast date of whatever saint for that day, and then the location. But Mission Santa Catalina de Afucia, also spelled Foica or Ahoica or Afuerica. There's lots of different spellings because, when you're saying Spanish fast, it's hard to always spell things correctly in another language, or even in your own language. So different variations of the spelling, but usually it's called Afucia. It was established in present-day Columbia County near the Timucuan River in 1608. probably as Mission San Martin de Ayacucho. It was on the Camino Real, that Spanish Royal Road. But what happened was, after the rebellion, it was moved to a site in Suwannee County. But it was abandoned about 10 years later, so it didn't last that long. There is lots of different discussions that one site, the San Martin, only lasted about 10 years, but then as that one closed up shop and disappeared from the records, this other one, Santa Catalina de Afucia, popped up within a couple miles of it. So it might have been the successor mission site to the original. Let's see, 1675, the San Agustin de Ahueca, which I had shown you earlier on one of the maps, the one possibly around the Suwannee Springs. That one they were relocated to Santa Catalina, but only 10 years later in 1685, Lord Cadros of Port Royal, which was English territory in the Caribbean, he incited some of the Yamasi Indians to raid and destroy that mission. And there's records existing of it. The Spanish records show that the mission chapel and the Franciscan houses were burned. 50 of the Timucua were slain, and then another 220 were taken as slaves. Port Royal was kind of like a den of all kinds of not nice stuff. Pirates, whatnot, until it was destroyed by an earthquake, if I believe correctly. Somebody say
Den of iniquity?
yes, one of those kinds of things, yes. I mean, if you think about the pirates before Blackbeard, but it's the 1600s, if you think about pirates, Port Royal that was their hangout. They could go there usually pretty freely. All kinds of stuff going on. Again, it was destroyed in an earthquake. A lot of people said it was, that was God's punishment for how they were. But this Lord Cadros, he had them attacked, and either the villagers killed or captured as slaves to come back to plantations. Other writings say that it might have been rebuilt even after that attack in 1685, but in 1690 or 1691 it was abandoned. There was some kind of dispute with the friar that lived there, and so it was abandoned, and most of the folks were moved to a mission site called Santa Fe, or Santo Tomas de Santa Fe. And that one in turn was relocated to San Francisco, Florida, in 1703. So lots of different discussions, lots of different histories, lots of even different locations. Another mission site in Suwannee County during this first mission period, Santa Cruz de Tarihica. It was originally established in either 1611 or 1612 at the Indian Pond site just over the border in Columbia County. And this is some drawings from when they were doing it. They were basically, I believe, building a subdivision on the property. And so they were allowed, the archaeologists were allowed to go in and do some preliminary digs, and this is part of that if I recall. But it was established in 1611, 1612. After the Timucuan uprising, it was moved closer to that Camino Real, to that Royal Road. After 1656, could have been Little River Springs. We're not sure, haven't found it yet. But either way, the occupants were moved to Santa Fe in 1691, so it was also abandoned. Let's see. Yeah, unfortunately, even all these changes of moving the mission sites closer to the Camino Real, even bringing in other Indian groups to this region, just was not enough to stop that decline. Not just of the mission series or the mission system, but just Spanish Florida also. You've got the disease, you've got continued attacks. There was a large set of attacks from the English, who now, by this point, were in the Carolinas. They attacked in 1702. Between 1702 and 1705, they wiped out pretty much every mission in North Florida, other than St. Augustine and Pensacola. You had those two extremes. Pretty much everything in between there was either destroyed or abandoned because they were about to be destroyed. The one in Tallahassee, the one I was just showing you earlier, they were abandoned as the English were basically, I can see them over the hills, they were abandoning and burning their buildings. So the English couldn't get them. Lots of destruction. So whichever mission sites in Suwannee County had survived up until that point were destroyed. It was abandoned. Basically, the interior of Florida was abandoned to the natives, so to speak. And the Spanish just kept Pensacola and St. Augustine. Everything else was, you know what, forget it. We can't continue to keep it. But there were possibly, some other non-mission settlements in North Florida and possibly even Suwannee County, some of which may have even survived those attacks from the English in the early 1700s. You've got two in the center of that map called Afucia and San Francisco. Now then, this map from, I don't even know if I've got the year, early 1700s. Where's the Suwannee River on there? Other than reading where it says Suwannee. No. That's what they thought it was, pretty much going north and south. So geography of Suwannee County, or what became Suwannee County, up until the early 1800s, shows the river something like this. They just had no clue as to how the river flowed. And so most of the maps that I have seen, and you have probably seen them, show it very similarly like this. Just up and down, north and south, maybe a few little offshoots. I mean, technically, this is actually the Suwannee River, and that was the Withlacoochee, but it's showing like that's the Suwannee. So they just didn't have a good idea of the layout of the river. But you can see here is the Spanish road, the Royal Road, and they've got two locations, San Francisco and Afucia, sometimes called Alachua. This should be the Santa Fe and Timucua rivers, based on the map. So if that is true, then we had those two sites that were not mission sites in Suwannee County. One of the maps I did not put in here shows Afucia even closer to Withlacoochee, up towards the north side of the Suwannee River. We don't really know anything about them. It's very possible, because they couldn't draw a map worth a flip back then, that they actually were located in Alachua County. And some, as they've studied more and more, they're starting to think, well, Afucia is Alachua, the modern day Alachua, that area. And San Francisco was a little bit north of Gainesville. So, don't know for sure. But this map shows it in Suwannee County, or what's now Suwannee County, so that's why it's in here for our Suwannee County history. But wherever it was located, these places were also abandoned by the mid-1700s. They couldn't keep it up. Indian attacks, English attacks, starvation, whatever it was. The Timucua continued to die, succumb to disease, to warfare. They were just caught in the middle between all these European powers. And gradually, very few of them were left. I mentioned earlier between 20,000 and 150,000 at one point in North Florida, South Georgia, of just the Timucua. Well, by the mid-1700s, I can count them on the fingers. They had pretty much abandoned those mission sites. They had moved, the remaining ones had moved to St. Augustine. And pretty soon they all could fit in one little mission over there. There was only one little small mission. In 1763 was the end of the 7 Years' War, because it lasted 7 years. We know it in our history as the French and Indian War, but everywhere else in the world they call it the 7 Years' War. Great Britain took over Florida from Spain. Basically, Spain said, well, they were given the option because Great Britain had captured a lot of territory. And they were given the option of, you can either keep Florida, and we'll keep Cuba, the English will keep Cuba, or you can have Cuba back and you'll just give us Florida. Cuba to them was much more of a money maker. So they took Cuba and said, you can have Florida, all of it, we don't want it. And so the British took over Florida in 1763. And the few Indians that were left, Timucua anyway, moved with the Spanish to Cuba. So again, between 20 and 150,000 Timucua in this area when the Europeans arrived in the early 1500s, but by the mid-1700s, they were down to just a few. By the end of the 1600s, there were only 1,000 or so. The last known Timucuan was a guy named Juan Alonso Cabale. He was born in 1709. He was born at that mission site in St. Augustine, still there. Mission Senora de la Leche, also known as Nombre de Dios. I think it's usually called Nombre de Dios today, but either way, it's still there, just to the north of the fort. He died in Guanabacoa, Cuba in 1767. So 4 years after Spain lost Florida, he and his wife moved over to Cuba, and that's where he died. So that was the end of Timucuan culture unlike a lot of Native American groups, the Timucua are extinct. You're not going to go to the Timucuan village and meet native Timucuans. It's not like the Seminoles, you can go down and see Seminoles, or a lot of those others out west. Timucuans are extinct, they're gone. I mean, it's possible that some that had fled the whole Spanish mission system, that had wandered out to the woods, maybe survived up until about 1820, but there's no positive identification. So Wanawazo Kabali is the last known Timucuan. And again, he's been dead since 1767. So, that brings us to the end of this presentation. Next month, Lord willing, we're going to talk about the British period of Suwannee County's history and also the second Spanish period.